Today, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what I think about when we're talking internally a little bit about what technology trends mean, how that affects us as Lend-Lease. So, yes, I've got my what I like to call my big boy picture up there. So that's occasionally what I like to look like when I'm talking to our executives. So for those of you who don't know, and many of you will, just a quick spin on what Lend-Lease actually is. So we're the largest company you've probably never heard of. So incorporated around about 1965, we're a property development, construction, civil engineering, funds management, treasury, telco, retirement living, land, apartments. We do military housing. We develop sporting stadiums. So if there's anything that you've ever been in, if there's any house you've ever lived in, if there's any apartment you've been in, odds on it was probably built by us or one of our guys. So we've built hundreds of thousands of buildings globally. We're in, as you would have heard Luke before, US, UK, Australia, Asia. We've been in places like China since about 1978. We've been in the US since the late 80s, and we've been in the UK around about since the 70s. So we're old, we're big, we're multinational. So let's talk a little bit about what I like to think about internally. So again, just for everybody, my job's thinking, right? So I talk to people, look at things, see what's happening on the market, and then we decide what our reaction is internally. Let's say that. So I've chucked this up here and I've put a little bit of a tag at the bottom, right? Corporations love to talk about innovation and disruption. They love to talk about it all the time, right? But sometimes it's just actually about interruptions inside your business, right? So a lot of people love to talk about it. It's actually very hard to, when you're in a large corporation, to actually bring any traction to disrupting yourselves. And a lot of that is about maybe disrupting yourself by partnering with people outside your organisation. It's very hard to see what your challenges are, what your opportunities are, if you're constantly looking at yourself. So a couple of little things which is interesting, particularly for us. Construction is probably one of the most difficult industries to disrupt. And to give you a bit of a concept of this, fundamentally, building has not changed since ancient Egyptian times. You build a hole, you put some bricks, you put something to hold the bricks together, you build it up, you might put something on there to make it look a little bit nice or be a little bit livable, right? Fundamentally, buildings have not changed in a long time. Even this building here, which is an incredibly connected, smart building, is fundamentally the same as buildings that everybody's been building since the 50s and 60s. Commercial construction, how houses are built, has not fundamentally changed. And that's a little bit around because particularly construction and property and stuff like that is a people-run business. And people are hard to disrupt. So what is the actual challenge, right? And one of the things I've sort of put up here, right, is in the background for those who can see, is a picture of an icebreaker, right? Corporations, unfortunately for you guys, are a little bit like icebreakers. They're big, they keep on going, and they have the tendency to unfortunately crush things in their way. One of the challenges for large corporations when we deal with smaller companies like you guys is how can we have, as Peter was saying this morning, this value exchange? Sometimes it's not useful for us to give you guys huge amounts of capital or to invest because occasionally that means then our competitors might not want to use your product or you'll be associated with other brand things. So what's the value exchange that corporations like us and others really should be thinking about in this new age? It's not just about money. Sometimes it's about subject matter expertise. Sometimes it's about showing you what it is that corporations do, how we operate, and why it's so difficult to deal with the way that corporations are structured. And it's really not about technology. I'm sure everybody's realised that at the end of the day. A lot of the things around innovation and disruption is about how you make a fundamental change in your business model, or in the way that you deal with customers, or the way that you deal with other businesses. So, I'm sure this won't shock anybody. The big challenge with dealing with larger businesses when you are a small, agile, fast-moving company is that big companies are all about managing risk. That is the reason that they are designed the way they are, and every company evolves into that, right? Companies and corporations, like us and other large corporations, are about process and compliance, right? Shareholder value, protecting the intellectual property and the model of the company. It's about planning and execution in a repeatable, robust methodology. Everything has to be robust from day one. You can't have another go. That's the unfortunate reality of working in corporations. So you can't experiment, because if you do, then you have issues with the other two parts. The other one is everybody loves planning and scoping. So the whole concept of doing any type of technology change or process change or organisational change is about making sure that you know what it is that you're going to do, so everybody can measure it at the end. So it actually makes it very difficult for corporations to be innovative and disruptive by themselves, because innovation and disruption and those sort of things is different, right? It's about experimenting and learning. It's about failing, or as my children's teacher likes to say, first attempt in learning. So it's not about failing. Start small and iterate. Like, don't spend any money on experiments. Make sure that you're trying to eke out the core truth of the customer problem that needs to be fixed, right? And that customer could be a big business. Like, it might just be a crazy process that's been done in corporations since the 1950s, which no one's ever been able to lift their head high enough to actually innovate on. But the big one is it's about creating opportunities to learn. And I'm not saying that corporations don't learn. They learn in different ways. But the time frame is so huge when you're looking at corporations versus small companies. So, a 6 to 12 to 18 to 24 month transformation, right? That's short in the world of, corporations. Changing the way your business model works. If anybody can get it done in less than 12 months, then that's lightning fast. And that doesn't gel well when you're trying to deal with smaller companies, because the rate of execution on a corporate is massively different. Days, weeks, months mean nothing to corporations, right? Because there's lots of layers that need to be dealt with there. And I mean, that's difficult when you're a company who's agile and fast and working on daily or even hourly or even monthly sort of cycles. So one of the things that corporations are not great at, right, is helping. Because sometimes what they think helping means is by help to turn you guys into corporations as well. And one of the things that particularly I think a bit about is it's not actually about turning startups into corporations. We've got plenty of corporations, right? Hundreds of them. It's about what's the next type of business that needs to be created. So, tech trends are interesting, right? Everybody loves them. TechCrunch, you look all through those, you get things in your LinkedIn and your Facebook and people email you things, right? They are interesting, but one of the problems is when you're in a large corporation is interesting does not mean valuable. And what means valuable is where you understand what it is that you're focusing on. And what you'll find when you talk to corporations, right, is they love talking about tech trends, right? And I'm sure you've had many people come and say to you, well, we're interested in blockchain. What can you do in blockchain, right? Unless you can anchor something which is important to the business, something which is important to their strategy, or even something which is meaningful to the way that they want to transform their business, they're just interesting. They're not useful or valuable. So there's a couple of things which I've chucked up on here, right, which is interesting and valuable to a corporation like us, right? And I'm sure there's a few of these that you would have seen before, but what what I'm sort of illustrating here is in the middle, I've put an anchor, right? So for want of a better word, I've called it Industry 4.0. So when you're in a large corporation, one of the things that's useful in trying to focus yourself on the type of the type of changes you want to invest in is to anchor it in a concept. And one of the things which you should do when you're dealing with large corporations is have a conversation with them about what they think their focus areas are, their strategic pillars, or whatever they want to call it, right? Because it gives you a hint into what they're interested in. So this one, which I've put up here, right, is a little bit about what we think, or what our industry is thinking will be the meaningful disruptor or the meaningful agent of change, right? So what you'll notice, I haven't put anything up here about process automation or robotics or smart cities or smart homes or virtual assistants or things like that, right? Because they're tech trends which help to make the problem or the symptoms less horrible for people, but don't actually attract or don't look to fix the fundamental issue. And so what this is sort of talking about here is, if you were to recreate the way that we did our business, which is about building and creating property, what would you actually do? And a lot of these are, well, I might actually make a digital version of every building, right? So I can reduce the risk of how we might construct or how things might happen, right? So about predicting what's going to happen in the future. What I might do is I might say, well, actually build every building I'm going to create, I want it to live, but I want it to live in a digital way. So I want it to tell me when it's sick. I want it to tell me when there's something else that needs to happen. I want it to tell me what's happening in its environment. City operating platforms, right? So people talk quite a bit about smart cities and smart homes and all those sort of things. It's not a problem that can be fixed. Don't put me on the record of that. But what can be done is if governments particularly start to think about cities in the same way that you think about anything from a technology perspective, right? How do I operate in a city in a standardized way? The way that if I want to build an iOS device, I don't have to think about how the operating system works. I just need to build the app. So if you had an operating system or an operating platform for a city, what could you do with your building? You don't have to worry about fundamentally how it works under the covers. That's an interesting problem, right? Augmented workers. So I'm sure everybody would have read all of the stuff in the press about how robotics and technology is going to get rid of all of these low-skilled jobs. It's a terrible way to talk about it. We actually see it a bit differently. So one of the things that we're looking at, because we employ hundreds of thousands of people globally, right? So in every country, like 120 countries in the world, we have hundreds of thousands of people who work for Lend-Lease building things. Whether they're subcontractors, whether they're people who, like you, come and visit one of our assets, right? So what we're talking about is, how do you augment workers? So how do you remove the busy work that wastes everybody's time? The greatest gift you can give to people is time, right? And as massively time-poor people, you understand that. The sad truth is that, particularly in the property and construction industry, people work 6 days a week. That's how it works. Everybody does, from everybody in this building through to the person digging a hole in the ground. So when we talk about augmenting workers, we're saying, well, the problem is time, not the process or the activity or the action that's being done, right? Now, there's a whole lot of other stuff around safety and all those things, but the core problem is time. So if we gave everybody who worked for Lend-Lease 7.5 hours, what's that worth to them? And what's that worth to us? So generative design, another interesting one. So it's a bit of a sort of highfalutin one here, but for anyone who's ever been an architect, architecture is, so I'm talking about building architecture here, 20% creativity and 80% boring, repetitive work. Most architects, when they're coming through any type of property and construction business, spend the first 5 years doing hundreds on hundreds of variations of the same design. Because usually the architect, who's the guy who designs the building, does one design, and then all the juniors have to do thousands of iterations of that manually. That is insane. We're training thousands of architects to effectively iterate through versions of things. So the concept behind generative design is, how do you take the concepts out of nature, so organic design, the way that animals build things, sprinkle a little bit of augmented machine learning and AI and all the magic sort of stuff that everyone's excited about, and get it to do that work. So it's very linked to this whole augmented worker as well, right? How do you allow people to spend less time on busy work and more time on impactful, meaningful work, which helps them? And then the last one is co-creation. And I know this is a little bit of a tridey one. The reality is, when you're a large corporation, is that you like to talk about how you work with people. But the reality is when we build you a $3.5 billion precinct like this, you don't actually get much of a choice on what you get, because we do it. You give us the money and we build it. The problem with that is that the way that people treat that transaction is very financial. I'm going to give you X amount, I'd like 13% return, I don't really care what it looks like. And one of the things that we're very interested in, right, is we don't want to look at buildings as buildings or as assets. What we actually want to start to think about is places. So how do you bring people to places? How do you make sure that places are positively landing on the landscape? So how do they change the way they work? How do you create experiences like, well, for argument's sake, like a startup precinct, right? What does that mean? It's not a building or a place. It's a combination of, types of people who are there, the type of work that gets done, the type of environment that's around, the retail, the way that transport works, right? So it's all connected. And the way that you want to bring these things together is more how you can help people to involve themselves in the creation process, but not at the cost of quality and risk and control. And that's the big one, right? Going back to the first page, every corporation is very, very, very reliant on its risk management process. All right, so, and I know a lot of people have talked about this before, but there you go. Here are a couple of things which I'm thinking about as well, right? So, number one, for anything to be any usefulness in this world going forward, data, open, available, everyone. The challenge with that, obviously, is everybody has also cottoned onto the fact that data is the new asset. And all corporations are hunkering down and trying to get as much as they can. But the challenge with that is that data by itself is just data. The actual valuable component is the insights that you bring out of that data. Support and create ecosystems of technology, right? So, and this is probably a bit easier for us. As not being a technology company, but we have a large technology team, right? The problem is when you create technologies which are proprietary, like you're the only one using them. So we have several technologies which are designed specifically for us, which is great, but they never change. So, we've spoken a lot about government. Government support is key, right? Compliance legislation changes helps corporations to justify why they should change. So it's actually a good driver. So I spoke a bit about the services, not data, but again, creating data is it's cool and it's exciting and you can create it, but unless there's a meaningful service attached to it, it's not really that much useful. And then the last one, which again, I'm sure, it's a bit of a no-brainer. People is the actual core of any type of disruption or innovation, right? If you don't understand how it's going to help or affect or change people, there's no reason for doing it. Purpose, why are you actually doing it? Sometimes corporations need to have a good hard look at themselves and think about Are we doing it because we think it's going to help, or are we doing it because it's going to help us? And then you lay technology in. Everybody loves to go to that as the first bow or the first arrow in their quiver. All right, cool. There you go. Sorry, that was a bit quick. No, it wasn't. It was 20 minutes. It was good. All right. Do we have any time for questions?
Fred not.
That was difficult. Cool. All right, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ciarán.